Midwest Weird will always be free to listen to, but it's not free to make. Join us on Patreon for bonus episodes and exclusive content, and you'll be supporting writers and creators as they continue to make weird and exciting work. Find a link in the show notes. A quick note. Some of the stories featured in Midwest Weird have elements of horror and may touch on trauma, mental health, and other tough topics. Take care when listening. This is Midwest Weird, an audio literary magazine from Broads and Books Productions. We're the home of weird fiction and nonfiction by Midwestern writers. Today's episode, a short story by Nick Thornton, titled Transcendental Boy, read by the author.
At 5 years old, James knew he felt different, but it wasn't until he sank right through his bedroom floor that he understood just how different he was. He'd been born on a Tuesday, an unremarkable day in an unremarkable hospital in an unremarkable town. He came into the world quietly, without a newborn's usual indignant theatrics. He simply smiled at his surroundings with a nonchalance that suggested the world outside had to work a little harder to surprise him. His early childhood was similarly unremarkable. He was sweet and even-tempered, even through the supposed terrible twos the other parents had warned about. On the contrary, James settled into his tender twos, matured into his thoughtful threes, and laughed and played through his friendly fours. For a child so young, his gregariousness caught people off guard, and he had no trouble making friends. James's parents, blessed as they were to have such a well-behaved son, took his easygoing nature as a license to drift. Freed from the tantrums and demands that seemed to plague other parents, they eagerly sank into their own routines, as if parenthood were a sideline to the lives they still deserved. With James tucked safely in his room or outside entertaining himself, his mother's yoga classes doubled, his father's poker nights stretched longer, and their weekends filled with dinners where they could gush about their perfect boy without the inconvenience of his actual presence. They loved him from a quiet distance, marveling at their own good fortune and stability, with the satisfaction of people who'd gotten everything just right. That is, until James, at age 5, sank into the floor. The story goes that just after midnight, James's parents were awoken by the sound of a cry, unfamiliar, muffled, but unmistakably his. They rushed into his room, expecting to find him tangled in his blankets after a nightmare. But there were no blankets. No James, for that matter. His bed was empty. Before they had a chance to fear the worst, the cry came again, this time from below. Kneeling, they looked for him under the bed, but found nothing but dust bunnies and shadows. His father pulled the bed away from the wall in a panic and set his ear to the floor, and there it was, scratching from beneath the floorboards. Within minutes, James's father had fetched a crowbar and pried up the wooden planks, and there, wrapped in a blanket and tucked between two dusty beams, was James. He'd been quiet then, too, nestled in his mother's arms after the ordeal, but his eyes were wide with bewilderment. His father couldn't help but think it was the look he'd expected to see when James was first born. Perhaps the world had finally given him something to be surprised about. After breakfast the next morning, James sat cross-legged on the living room carpet and breathlessly recounted the nightmare he'd had. He'd been playing in a house that looked like his, but wasn't. He heard his parents' voices and got up to look for them, but the hallways stretched on for miles. The doors opened to strange rooms, and the floor turned into thick, sticky mud that sucked at his feet. He heard them laughing somewhere in another room and called for help, but his voice came out small. The mud pulled him down bit by bit until the top of his face was just poking out of the floor. When it covered his head completely, he woke up. The look of dim comprehension on his parents' faces suggested they were waiting for some further explanation, which struck James as silly. He told the story and he told it well. Did they not hear the bit about the thick, sticky mud? He said it again, just in case, louder and slower, so he could be sure they got it this time. They both cried out in shock, and it startled James. Maybe he was too good of a storyteller. It was only then he'd realized he was up to his shoulders in floor, and deigned to join them in their shocked cries. That night marked the beginning of James's sinking episodes, and from then on it happened with an alarming regularity. Anytime he was perfectly still, in fact. It only took a little movement for him to reverse course, like swimming back to the surface of a body of water, but he couldn't let his guard down for a second. To his parents' credit, they exhausted almost every avenue in an attempt to, if you'll pardon the pun, get to the bottom of his predicament. By the time James was 7, it was difficult to find a flat surface in the house that wasn't covered in a mishmash of brochures and literature encompassing a wide range of professions, some more reputable than others, though all united in their shared inability to offer anything helpful. He'd often scan the mess of loose papers as he slurped his chocolate cereal in the morning, idly kicking his legs back and forth in the chair. There were doctors, scientists, religious leaders, various politicians at all levels of government. He suspected the pamphlet with a large illustrated eyeball might have been from a UFO cult. Next to that was the number for a lawyer his father found through a TV commercial. James snorted as he imagined the lawyer trying to prosecute the ground in criminal court. He shouted across the room to his father through a mouth too full of cereal, "Grounds for arrest!" A punchline to a joke whose setup he hadn't bothered to share. He wasn't listening anyway. Time, as it does, marched on with a stolid indifference to life's hardships. Familiarity dulled the extraordinary. Somewhere in their endless search for an expert in unnatural boy-floor relations, his parents realized no such person existed. So, faced with burnout, they just stopped worrying. James didn't share this luxury. By age 10, he existed on the edge of exhaustion. It was a 1-2 punch of the ever-present fear of being swallowed by the earth, and the various tics and fidgets he'd employed to prevent it. It necessitated a part of his brain remaining dedicated to the effort, which had the unfortunate effect of preventing him from ever being fully present. This, of course, wasn't lost on his teachers or schoolmates, who branded him a space cadet and generally left him to his fidgeting. This constant vigilance worked to erode his boyish charms, revealing sharper edges as a teenager. He felt isolated by his strange condition. He got out on occasion at the behest of his concerned parents, but similar scenes would always play out. A birthday party sleepover was cut short after someone's little sister got up in the middle of the night for a drink and screamed when she saw James through the kitchen window, clawing his way out of the backyard like some sort of undead ghoul. Other times, a movie on TV might prove too engrossing, and the momentary lapse in attention would see him fall into the basement, or once, to his chagrin, plop down onto the lap of a friend's father in the living room below. On one notable occasion, he'd fallen asleep during a car ride to a local play, and startled awake to his body tumbling in a barrel roll along the dirt road. The cast that was put on his right arm that night in the hospital would be removed 6 weeks later, bearing only 3 signatures: Mom, Dad, and the boy driving the car that night, Danny Daniels. Danny, or Dan as James came to call him, was a small, quiet boy he'd met as a junior in high school. His thick glasses made his eyes appear twice their normal size, which made it even easier for James to notice when he was staring at him again from across the classroom. Most people avoided the discomfort of acknowledging his presence, as he suspected it meant they must also acknowledge uncomfortable truths they'd just as soon ignore, as if anyone could be a bigger authority on burying one's head in the sand. He could only wonder idly what terrible things Danny was thinking when he was looking at him. But when the last day of school came and Danny finally approached him, he'd only asked James if he really sunk through the floor. When he replied cautiously that he did, maybe more bitterly than he'd meant to sound, Danny's response was only a single word: "Cool." They shared a kiss that summer inside a sleeping bag on a rainy night in a small tent. James said he didn't want to drag Dan into the earth with him if he sank. Didn't really know what was even possible. But Dan said he didn't mind. He said he'd crawl through the mud with him, like two weird little worms breaching the surface together after a storm. It was the first time James could ever remember feeling accepted. Later that same summer, after the incident in the car, James stopped returning Dan's calls. He thought he deserved to see plays. When they returned to school the following year, it was to the world as strangers. After graduating, James moved into a small apartment a state away, on the ground floor, of course. He thought his parents might try to dissuade him from the move, but if anything, they seemed excited, maybe even relieved. They sent a check in the mail each month to cover rent, tucked into a letter that got progressively shorter as time passed. He was 22 when he resolved to let the ground take him. The sinking had worsened with age, and he was tired. The apartment's carpet bore a circular path where the fibers had been worn away by years of pacing. James sat in the middle of this circle with his legs crossed and took a deep breath. He closed his eyes, taking inventory of his body. It took a moment for him to quell the small ticks and taps from his limbs as they came on almost involuntarily, but he soon rediscovered the stillness he'd once known as a small boy. With his eyes closed, James felt the familiar sensation of descending through the floor. It felt thick and cool as it traveled up his body. The carpet tickled his nose as his head went under. He'd compared the feeling to sinking in mud as a child, but that wasn't quite right. It was almost effervescent against his skin, like submerging in a bath of television static. It was dark in the dirt, but in his mind's eye he fell through clouds of white noise. A soft buzz fluttered over him in waves as he descended, cascading from his toes to his head where it gently intonated like a bell between his ears. The buzzing then thinned until it felt almost liquid, and he imagined sliding against it down a tight tunnel in a rain cloud. The sound in turn melted into a delicate chime that rang in an odd kind of harmony with the others. He found a strange serenity in giving up, and yet he struggled to accept it. A purple sort of light shone through the dark below. It had the odd property of filtering through the rocks and soil in a way that rendered them completely transparent. James was surprised to find he could see at a distance. The light that shimmered below seemed to emanate from a kind of bioluminescent fungi that dotted the visible expanse like stars in the night sky. Clusters of them grouped in dense subterranean galaxies, their light refracting through the prismatic streams that snaked between them to resemble the streaking lights of an aurora. It was teeming with life. Small, burrowing creatures flitted around like hummingbirds before vanishing into the dark, and a massive horned serpent roared by with the power and fluidity of a dragon in flight, its body covered in scales that had the appearance of delicate porcelain. James imagined himself not sinking, but instead rising up into the stars. He imagined this was his life. Maybe one of the doctors or priests he'd visited as a child had miraculously discovered a simple solution, and after a single treatment or blessing, he'd felt the tether that once bound him so tightly to the ground slacken, snap entirely, freeing him from the jealous pull of gravity. Or perhaps he'd spent a genie's wish on a cure, and this was the ironic method of fulfillment the genie had chosen. Not that he'd mind. Maybe it was God, recognizing the mistake made in burdening an innocent boy with such a terrible curse, and deciding to make things right by blessing him with this wondrous gift so that he might be closer to him in heaven, where he could beg his forgiveness. How hard it must have been, he'd say. How terribly hard. And yet, he knew exactly where he was. He always did. And no amount of make-believe could change that. Wishing to fly felt ridiculous to James, but why should it? Despite the equally impossible nature of the two, he felt it to be true that an impossibly bad thing happening to a good person was still more likely than an impossibly good thing happening to anyone. Whether it could be owed to a divine test of one's will, karmic retribution for misdeeds in a past life, or just bad luck, it hardly mattered. He fell further into the subterranean starfield until he saw an expanding point of light that shone brighter than the others. The iron core of the Earth hung there like a distant sun, a glittering jewel suspended in a translucent orange nebula. James could feel its warmth on his cold skin. It beckoned to him like a mother calling out to her child. The light saw his pain. The warmth dried his tears. The people up there didn't understand him, but the light did, and it wanted him to come home. After a lifetime of calling out to him, it was time to put the pain to rest. James thought about his parents. They'd understood, for a time at least, but they didn't know how to help him anymore. The light from the Earth's core grew brighter as he made his gradual approach. The purple starlight from the fungi gradated to brilliant reds and oranges, as if James was sliding into a sunset. He felt the effervescent buzz against his body, and the tones that chimed melodiously in his head swell together, building towards a crescendo. There had been others who understood. James thought of Miss Delia, his second-grade teacher. She'd been kind when others weren't, more tolerant of his necessary eccentricities. She'd even checked in on him in third grade, but he hadn't seen her in years. He could hardly see the starlight anymore, so dazzling had the core's light become. Its heat kissed his skin, wrapped him in a tender embrace. He never had to feel pain again. James thought about Dan. He'd understood. Through sheer force of empathic will, he'd understood better than anyone. Dan was the best person James knew by a long shot, but he'd pushed him away. Why? Because he hated himself for burdening him. Because he hadn't felt worthy of his warmth. The core filled his sight like a new sky. It overwhelmed his senses, shook his teeth, filled his ears with a chorus of discordant chimes that cried for him to come home. Its warmth intensified to a blistering heat that blackened his clothing and scorched his hair. But it was still nothing compared to the warmth he felt that summer night in a tent under the stars. The warmth he felt with the boys so nice they named him twice. The light burned through James, searing his skin and filling his lungs with fire. The fight returned to him all at once. He put the light to his back and kicked against the earth, clawed fistfuls of invisible stone and soil. Inch by excruciating inch, he pulled himself up through these undiscovered depths, miles and miles below the earth, against the greedy pull that promised to end his pain, but asked for everything in return. The chimes howled for him. A month had passed since James had woken up in a rain-soaked parking lot to a little girl poking him in the ribs with an umbrella. She'd made sure to loudly tell him he looked like a burnt marshmallow before the ambulance pulled away, and he only felt a little bad about telling her what she could do with that umbrella. He hadn't expected anyone to visit him in the hospital, least of all Dan, but there he was. He'd somehow heard the news and dropped everything to see James, who was as surprised by his own tears as he was by the unexpected reunion. Why should he be surprised that Dan cared? Their last time together had been in a hospital, all those years ago when James broke his arm rolling down a dirt road. So when they walked out together a month later, it felt to James as if he'd been given another chance to choose the path not taken. Picking up where they left off was easy. When James felt himself sinking in their shared apartment and panicked, Dan would hold him, coaxing him to stillness. They'd sink together, slowly, with intention. When his breathing slowed, they'd kick their legs and float gently back to their bed, skin smelling of petrichor. In time, they went deeper together, through the fungal constellations and the prismatic streams, among the schools of electric beetles and glowworms, Entire oceans hid beneath the earth that played host to creatures that defied description, whose incandescent skin pulsed with new colors that felt like seeing music, who seemed to dance in and out of space between worlds. Returning didn't feel like a struggle anymore as much as a dance. They'd rise to the surface and settle softly like a feather onto the cool sheets of their bed, where they'd stay up all night, describing the indescribable, sharing in what once felt isolating. Years later, they'd float above the crowd dancing at their wedding, looping slow circles in each other's orbit. They gently kicked out in rhythm, swimming together through the air as they'd so often done below the earth. It felt effortless, and maybe it always had been so. The years were kind to them. They made a home filled with quiet rituals and unspoken understanding. Mornings often began with the two of them sitting cross-legged on the floor, breathing in sync as the early light filtered through the window. They'd sink and rise together, learning how to be still without fear. Some evenings, they'd lie side by side, talking and laughing late into the night until sleep took them both. And on joyful days, they would fly. James was a day shy of 90 when he took Dan Dan's hand and led him outside. The heat from the day lingered inside their house, but the night air carried the chill of fall. They walked slowly, carefully, their shoes crunching on the gravel driveway. James had become so thin, and Dan Dan felt as though the cool breeze might carry him off. He'd squeeze James's hand in a quick pulse with each gust, and James would squeeze back a little lighter. They found the path they'd walked countless times, through the trees by their house that opened into a large grassy field. The surrounding trees shielded them from the lights in the neighborhood, allowing their eyes to adjust enough to see the stars. They were as beautiful as they'd ever seen them, pearlescent whites, brilliant sapphires, ruby reds, and emerald greens that swirled and danced without moving. They still held hands as they touched their heads together. Dan Dan closed his eyes and kissed James on the forehead. He felt lighter still. With a final squeeze, he let him go. James imagined himself rising up into the stars. He imagined this was his life.
Nick Thornton is a speculative fiction writer whose work explores the intersection of cosmic weirdness and human connection. We'll be back in 2 weeks with more weird stories. If you like what you hear and would like to support writers of weird stories, check out our Patreon. You'll get bonus episodes, early access to perks, and much more. View the link in our show notes. And if you want your fiction or nonfiction to appear on Midwest Weird, send us your work. Read the show notes for a submission link. Thanks for joining us, and stay weird.